They told us America's story began with courage, a band of visionaries defying an empire, standing tall for freedom, democracy, and the pursuit of happiness. It's the story we learned in classrooms, the one printed in history books, neat, noble, and polished. But behind the neatness lies the noise, the erased, the inconvenient, the forgotten. Because every nation has two histories, the one it tells and the one it hides. The official story was written by those who won, or more precisely, by those who were allowed to write. They chose what to remember and what to forget. Every flag, every monument, every textbook line carries that choice. And if you look closely enough, if you listen between the lines, you'll hear whispers of another America. An America built not only by the famous names etched in marble, but by millions whose stories were never carved in stone. History, they say, is written by the victors. But what happens when the victors decide that certain truths are too dangerous to remember? When the price of a nation's pride is the silence of its people? There's a comfort in the story we know. The heroes, the battles, the triumphant marches. But comfort breeds blindness, and blindness over time becomes belief. What if America's greatest myth isn't just about destiny or freedom, but about how well it learned to forget? Each document hides a contradiction. Each archive, a confession waiting to be heard. And as centuries passed, these forgotten echoes shape the world we live in now. From who owns the land beneath our feet, to who's allowed to stand tall on it. This isn't a story about guilt. It's a story about discovery, about reclaiming what was buried, because truth, even when uncomfortable, is what binds a nation to its humanity. We're not here to destroy the story of America. We're here to complete it, to bring light into the shadows where the true architects of this country, indigenous leaders, enslaved survivors, immigrant dreamers, working women, still wait to be remembered. And maybe, by telling their stories, we'll understand that history isn't just behind us. It's alive, breathing, shaping who we are and who we dare to become. This is Best Hidden America. And this is the story beneath the story. When we think of the founding fathers, we picture powdered wigs, parchment, and speeches about liberty. But what if the birth of America wasn't written only in ink and ideals, but also in blood, sweat, and silence? The real foundation of this nation wasn't laid by a handful of men in Philadelphia. It was built by thousands whose names history forgot to mention. Long before the Declaration of Independence echoed through the colonies, native nations had already established complex systems of governance, democratic councils that valued balance, representation, and unity. The Iroquois Confederacy, for instance, practiced a form of federalism that inspired the very framework of the U.S. Constitution. Yet, when the ink dried on that sacred document, the voices that helped shape it were nowhere to be found. The founders spoke of freedom, while enslaved men and women built their homes, cooked their meals, and raised their children. The first White House stood on the backs of black laborers who never tasted the liberty they helped symbolize. For every signature on the Constitution, there were hundreds of calloused hands that would never hold a pen, yet held up a nation. And then there were the women, invisible in the portraits, absent in the debates, yet ever present in the struggle. They mended uniforms, carried messages across battle lines, and kept families alive through war and famine. Abigail Adams once wrote, "Remember the ladies," but history rarely did. Behind every hero carved in stone stood an army of unnamed heroes, native scouts who guided expeditions, freedmen who fought in America's earliest wars, immigrant craftsmen who shaped cities from wood and dust. They were the architects of the invisible America, the one without monuments, without medals, but with stories that refused to die. We celebrate the men who dreamed of liberty, but seldom the people who paid its price. And yet, it is their courage, their endurance, that gave meaning to the words, "We the people," because we, all of us, are the people. Not just the privileged few who signed the papers, but the countless souls who endured chains, hunger, exile, and hope so that this nation could rise. The forgotten founders didn't stand behind podiums or draft proclamations. They stood in fields, in forges, in kitchens, and on battlefields, where freedom wasn't a theory, but a distant dream worth dying for. History tells us that liberty was born in 1776. But the truth is, liberty was born every time someone chose to believe in a future they might never see. And it's that belief, whispered through generations, that shaped the real America, because the story of this country isn't complete without them. They are the foundation beneath the foundation, the invisible pillars holding up the dream. And now, after centuries of silence, their stories are finally being heard. This is not about rewriting history. It's about revealing the full truth. The truth that freedom has always been collective, and that every name forgotten was a sacrifice remembered by time itself. They called it manifest destiny, a divine mission, the belief that America was chosen to stretch from ocean to ocean. A land promised by God, claimed by men. But behind that shining phrase lay shadows darker than any frontier night. The story we were told was one of courage, discovery, and progress. The story we weren't told was one of fire, blood, and betrayal. The westward expansion wasn't just a journey, it was an invasion. As settlers pushed west, thousands of native nations were pushed out. Treaties signed with promises of peace were broken before the ink was dry. Whole tribes vanished, not by accident, but by design. Imagine being told that your home, your river, your ancestors' graves no longer belonged to you, that the soil beneath your feet was now America's destiny. The Trail of Tears wasn't destiny. It was displacement, forced by greed wrapped in prophecy. And yet, the resilience of those who survived remains one of the greatest acts of defiance in history. As the frontier moved forward, so did the myth. Textbooks spoke of pioneers and progress, not the villages burned or the treaties betrayed. It was easier to tell a story of conquest than to confront the cost. It was easier to glorify the settlers than to acknowledge the suffering they left behind. For the native peoples, the frontier never ended. It became a wound that never healed, a battle not of muskets and maps, but of memory and survival. To this day, the echoes of manifest destiny still shape the struggle over land, sovereignty, and justice. When we see protests against pipelines or the fight for sacred lands, we are not witnessing something new. We are seeing the continuation of a story centuries old, the descendants of those first displaced still defending what little remains. But this isn't just about the past. It's about the pattern, the way we glorify expansion and innovation while forgetting the lives beneath its weight. We celebrate the gold rush, but not the rivers poisoned by mercury. We admire the railroads, but not the Chinese laborers who died laying the tracks. We honor the dream of opportunity, yet ignore the millions for whom that dream was never meant. Manifest destiny was never destiny. It was a choice, and choices have consequences. The myth told us that greatness required conquest. But the truth is, greatness requires remembrance. To understand America, we must see beyond the myth, to recognize that progress and pain have always walked side by side. Every mile claimed, every mountain crossed, came at a human cost we still feel today. And maybe acknowledging that doesn't make us weaker. Maybe it makes us more honest, more human, because a nation that can face its past without fear of shame is a nation capable of real growth. The story of manifest destiny isn't just history, it's a mirror. It asks us to look closer, to question what we celebrate, and to decide what kind of destiny we want to believe in next. The frontier may be gone, but the reckoning with its legacy has only just begun. Progress, that word built America, but behind every shining invention, every towering factory, every new dawn of industry, there were echoes, the sounds of lives consumed by the very machine they powered. The Industrial Revolution promised a future of abundance, comfort, and strength. But for millions, it became a war for survival. The textbooks called it a golden age. The workers called it something else. Picture the factories of the late 1800s, smoke thick enough to hide the sun. The hiss of steam and the clang of iron. Men, women, and children, some no older than 8, laboring for 12, 14 hours a day. The air burned your lungs. The machines never stopped. And if you fell behind, there was always someone desperate enough to take your place. Progress had a price, and it was paid in flesh. We celebrate the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Fords, the captains of industry. But we rarely speak of the millions who made their empires possible. The miners who never saw daylight, the textile girls who coughed their lives away in cotton dust, the immigrants who crossed oceans for opportunity only to find chains made of wages instead of iron. America's greatness was built not only on innovation, but on exhaustion. Every gleaming skyscraper stood on the backs of those whose names we'll never know. And when they finally rose up, when the workers demanded to be seen, the response wasn't applause. It was bullets. The fight for labor rights wasn't a negotiation. It was a battlefield. Strikes turned into massacres. The Haymarket Affair, Ludlow, Pullman, moments erased or softened in our collective memory. They weren't just labor disputes. They were cries for dignity. They were the foundation of every right we take for granted today. The 8-hour workday, weekends, safety laws, all born from suffering. And then there were the forgotten minds, the thinkers, inventors, and pioneers whose brilliance was buried under the weight of prejudice. Women who changed science but were told their discoveries belonged to their male colleagues. Black inventors who transformed industries but were denied credit or patents or even their names in the papers. Progress demanded heroes, but it decided who was allowed to be one. The light bulb shines, the engine roars, the skyline glows, but every spark, every turn carries a hidden story. The invisible ones, the silenced ones. Today we live surrounded by the gifts of that era, comfort, speed, technology, yet the echoes remain. Factory towns turned ghostly, rivers still poisoned, families still fighting for fair wages. The revolution never truly ended, it just changed its form. Gig workers instead of mill workers, warehouses instead of factories. The rhythm of exhaustion set to a digital beat. Progress is not the villain, but it is not the hero either. It's a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance of human ambition and the darkness of human cost. So the next time we celebrate innovation, perhaps we should pause, listen closely, because somewhere, beneath the hum of machines and the glow of screens, those silenced voices still whisper, they built the world we live in. And the least we can do is remember their names. In every great discovery, there is a story we're told, and another one we're not. The story we know celebrates the genius, the lone inventor, the brilliant scientist, the visionary who changed the world. But the truth, innovation has never been a solo act. It's a symphony. And too often, the most beautiful notes are the ones history chose not to hear. For every Edison, there was a Lewis Latimer, the son of escaped slaves who made the modern light bulb possible. For every NASA headline, there were Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson. Black women whose calculations sent humanity beyond the sky while they worked in segregated offices. For every lab breakthrough, there were women told to take notes while men took credit. These are not footnotes in history. They are history. They were innovators without recognition, dreamers without stage lights. And yet their work shaped the world around us, silently, powerfully, permanently. Think of Alice Ball, who found the first effective treatment for leprosy before her death at 24. Her discovery was stolen, her name erased for decades. Or Dr. Charles Drew, whose pioneering work on blood plasma saved millions during World War II, even as he was denied the right to give blood because of his race. Think of Rosalind Franklin, whose photograph revealed the structure of DNA, only for the credit to go elsewhere. Progress often wears a mask. one that hides the uncomfortable truth about who gets remembered. It's not just about talent, it's about access, power, privilege. While history crowned a few men as visionaries, countless others worked in the shadows, building the foundations of modern life. The typewriter, the traffic light, the computer algorithm, the cell phone, all shaped by minds long ignored or intentionally forgotten. But even in silence, brilliance leaves traces. Every bridge that stands, every plane that flies, every vaccine that saves, carries fingerprints of those denied their place in the spotlight. Their genius was not diminished by their exclusion. It was amplified by it. Because to innovate without recognition is an act of defiance, and perhaps that's the truest form of genius, not just to invent, but to persist, to keep creating in a world determined not to see you. Today, their stories are resurfacing, reclaimed by new generations who refuse to let history be one-sided. Students uncovering hidden archives, filmmakers telling the untold, communities demanding truth, not myth. We're beginning to see the real face of American innovation, diverse, resilient, and unstoppable. A story not of one mind, but of millions. Of those who believed that intelligence had no color, that creativity had no gender, and that the future belonged to everyone willing to dream it. Innovation has always been about breaking barriers, not just scientific ones, but social ones. And when we remember all who built our world, we don't just honor the past. We rewrite the future, because progress, real progress, is not about who gets the credit. It's about who gets the chance. When we think of the civil rights movement, we see the marches in Selma, the speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., the dream that echoed across the world. But beyond the camera flashes and the headlines, another story unfolded, quieter, harder, and just as heroic. It wasn't confined to one city or one man. It was a movement made of thousands of voices, rising from every corner of America. Long before the world heard, "I have a dream," there were sharecroppers in Mississippi risking their lives to register to vote. There were domestic workers in Georgia boycotting buses they could barely afford to ride. There were students in Greensboro sitting at lunch counters, demanding to be treated as human beings. They were beaten, jailed, silenced. Yet they kept showing up because dignity was worth the cost. The movement wasn't born in Washington. It was born in kitchens, churches, barbershops, and dusty backroads. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Women like Ella Baker, who believed that strong people don't need strong leaders. They need a movement that belongs to everyone. Fannie Lou Hamer, who faced police brutality and still stood before the nation to say, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." Bayard Rustin, the strategist behind the March on Washington, a man whose brilliance was nearly erased because of who he loved. Their courage built the foundation, not for a moment, but for a generation. And as cameras turned away, the struggle continued. Civil rights didn't end in 1968. It evolved into new battles, new voices, new front lines. The fight for equality expanded into education, housing, healthcare, and the right to simply exist without fear. In the 1970s, black farmers fought to keep their land. Latino workers demanded fair pay and safe conditions in the fields. Native activists stood at Wounded Knee, reclaiming stolen voices. And decades later, the echoes continued, in the protests for justice, in the cries for freedom, in the chants that filled the streets of Ferguson, Minneapolis, and beyond. This is the broader canvas of civil rights, not a closed chapter, but a living, breathing story. It stretches across generations, races, and struggles, bound by one shared truth. Freedom has never been given. It has always been demanded, and with each new generation, the torch is passed, sometimes quietly, sometimes in flames. Young people today march not just for racial equality, but for gender, climate, and economic justice. They stand where others once stood, facing new versions of old injustices. History may change its setting, but not its rhythm. The same heartbeat of resistance still pulses beneath every act of courage. And every time someone stands up, every time someone refuses to be silent, they become part of that same unbroken line. A line that stretches from the cotton fields to the city streets, from the pulpits to the protests, from past to present. Civil rights is not history, it's humanity in motion. And it reminds us of something timeless, that justice is not inevitable. It is built, it is fought for, it is protected over and over again, because equality is not a gift, it's a promise. And the power to keep that promise has always rested, not in the hands of the few, but in the voices of the many. There are places in America where the past is not gone, it's built into the streets themselves. If you look closely, you can still trace the lines. They're not on maps anymore, but they live in the bricks, the schools, the homes, and in the air we breathe. This is the legacy of redlining, one of the most silent and devastating systems ever drawn in ink. In the 1930s, government maps colored America's neighborhoods, green for good, red for hazardous. But what decided those colors wasn't safety or opportunity. It was skin. If you were black or lived near people of color, your community was marked red, unfit for investment. Banks refused loans. Insurance companies denied coverage. Businesses left, and with them, the future left too. Generations were trapped in neighborhoods, starved of resources, stripped of value, and fenced off from the American dream. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, white families built equity. Homes that grew in worth, schools that thrived, and parks that bloomed. This wasn't just geography. It was destiny, engineered by design. Even after redlining was outlawed, the damage stayed. Because poverty has memory, because wealth grows roots, and because the walls built by policy are harder to tear down than any wall of brick. Today, those same red lines echo in our zip codes, determining who gets clean air, who has access to quality education, and who can afford health care. You can predict a child's life expectancy just by their address. Not because of choices, but because of history. In cities like Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, the pattern repeats. Areas once marked hazardous still have fewer hospitals, fewer grocery stores, and higher crime rates. It's not coincidence, it's consequence. And yet, within those same neighborhoods, something powerful happened. Resilience grew, culture flourished, communities built beauty from neglect. Music, art, activism, born from places America tried to erase. From the jazz clubs of Harlem to the murals of South Central Los Angeles, every beat, every brushstroke was defiance, because people refused to be defined by the lines that confined them. Still, the shadow remains. Redlining may no longer be law, but its fingerprints stain every mortgage policy, every zoning plan, every debate over who belongs where. In 2025, we still see its reflection in the wealth gap between white and black families, in the underfunded schools, in neighborhoods where opportunity feels like a rumor. But history's greatest lesson is this: systems built by people can be changed by people. Across the country, movements are rising, activists, educators, and homeowners fighting to rewrite the story. Cities are investing in affordable housing, banks are being held accountable, and communities are demanding not charity, but justice. Redlining drew lines to divide America. But now, a new generation is drawing lines of its own, lines of connection, of empowerment, of truth, because knowing where we've drawn the lines is the first step to erasing them. And when we finally see that the map of injustice is not fixed, we realize that the future isn't written in red or green, but in the courage of those willing to redraw it. Sometimes, the air you breathe can tell you where you stand in society. And for millions of Americans, that air has always carried more than just oxygen. It carried injustice. The story of environmental inequality doesn't begin in the modern era. It's rooted deep in centuries of neglect, discrimination, and profit disguised as progress. For decades, factories, refineries, and toxic waste sites didn't appear by accident near poor communities or neighborhoods of color. They were placed there, deliberately, strategically, quietly, because land was cheaper, because voices there were easier to ignore. In places like Cancer Alley, Louisiana, an 85-mile stretch lined with petrochemical plants, families have lived for generations under skies that glow orange at night. Here, cancer rates are among the highest in the nation. Children grow up playing near pipelines instead of playgrounds. And yet, their stories rarely make headlines. It's not just the South. From Flint, Michigan, where lead filled the water, to Navajo Nation, where uranium mines poisoned the earth, to Port Arthur, Texas, where refineries cloud the air with toxins. These are not isolated incidents. They are chapters of a single, ongoing story. A story of who America decides to protect and who it chooses to sacrifice. Environmental injustice is not only about pollution. It's about policy. It's about zoning laws that place industrial plants next to homes. It's about politicians who trade public health for corporate dollars. It's about communities forced to fight for the basic right to breathe clean air, drink safe water, and live without fear of contamination. But history shows something else too: resistance. In the 1980s, long before climate justice became a global rallying cry, Black, Indigenous, and Latino communities were already on the front lines, organizing protests, filing lawsuits, demanding to be seen. It was mothers, church leaders, and teachers who first said, enough. Enough of our neighborhoods being treated like dumping grounds. Enough of our children paying the price for someone else's profit. And their voices began to change the world. Their courage gave birth to an entire movement, one that recognized that environmental health and human rights are the same fight, that saving the planet means saving people first. Today, the echoes of that struggle continue. In 2025, the effects of environmental injustice remain visible from coast to coast. Rising asthma rates, contaminated soil, and disappearing coastlines where once thriving communities stood. But something has shifted. The silence is gone. Social media, documentaries, and community science projects have exposed what was once buried. We now know where pollution lives and who it hurts most. And with that knowledge comes responsibility. Across America, local heroes are fighting back. Activists in New Orleans, Detroit, and Standing Rock are teaching us what real environmental justice looks like. Not just saving trees, but saving lives. Not just reducing emissions, but restoring dignity. Because the truth is this: the earth remembers. Every chemical spill, every poisoned river, every forgotten town. The planet keeps the receipts, and so do the people. Environmental injustice isn't a natural disaster. It's a man-made wound. But wounds can heal when we stop pretending they don't exist and start listening to those who have lived in their shadow the longest. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the land beneath our feet, they are not privileges. They are promises, and until every community, from the richest suburb to the smallest reservation, can share in that promise, America's story of freedom will remain incomplete, because justice that ignores the earth will always fall short of justice for humanity. When most people think of colonialism, they imagine a distant past. Sailing ships, signed treaties, and vanished empires. But for millions of native people across America, colonialism never ended. It simply changed its face. For them, history isn't something locked away in textbooks. It's a living wound, still bleeding through courtrooms, pipelines, and stolen promises. Every treaty ever signed between the US government and native nations carried a single, silent truth. It was written to be broken. From the Trail of Tears to the Dakota Access Pipeline, from reservations carved out of ancestral land to schools built to erase language and culture, the story of Native America is not one of disappearance. It's one of survival against all odds. Today, over 570 federally recognized tribes exist across the United States. Each one is a testament to resilience, and each one still fights every day for sovereignty that was promised but never fully honored. In the 19th century, the US government used force. In the 20th, it used bureaucracy. And in the 21st, it uses economics. The methods changed. The mission did not. Consider the fight over land. Much of what is now called America was never truly sold, never truly ceded, only taken. Even now, legal battles rage over sacred sites turned into mining zones, oil fields, and tourist attractions. Mountains once prayed to are blasted for minerals. Rivers once called relatives are redirected for profit. And yet, despite centuries of exploitation, native nations remain the original stewards of this land, guardians of the same ecosystems that modern governments now scramble to protect. It's ironic, isn't it? The same people once forced off their lands are now the leaders in protecting them. In Standing Rock, Lakota and Dakota water protectors stood unarmed against militarized police to defend the Missouri River, not just for themselves, but for millions downstream. Their chant, Maniwikoni, water is life, became a global symbol of resistance. Across the country, native communities are reviving their languages, restoring their governance, and reclaiming their heritage. Tribes like the Yurok in California have regained control of ancestral forests to heal both the land and their people. The Cherokee Nation has rebuilt its health system, proving that sovereignty isn't just about territory. It's about self-determination, dignity, and survival. But the struggle isn't over. Even today, corporations seek to extract resources from native lands without consent. Court cases drag on for decades, often ending in settlements that can never replace what was lost. Because how do you put a price on identity, on sacred ground, on history itself? Yet the story of native sovereignty is not one of victimhood. It's a story of endurance, of people who remember when the stars still guided migration and the rivers still carried songs, of elders who whisper to the young, "We are still here." And that phrase, "We are still here," isn't just survival. It's defiance. It's a declaration that America's oldest nations are also its future. In 2025, a new generation of native leaders, artists, and activists are reshaping what sovereignty means. They're using technology, film, and education to reclaim their stories. Stories once told about them, now told by them. They remind us that sovereignty is not granted by any government. It is inherited, written in the earth, carried in the blood, spoken in the language of ancestors. And until that truth is fully recognized, America will remain haunted by the ghosts of the treaties it broke, because history, when ignored, doesn't fade. It waits. It waits beneath the soil, in the rivers, in the names of the mountains, until someone finally listens. So the question isn't whether native sovereignty will be restored. It's whether America is ready to honor the word it gave and the land it still calls home. History remembers the great wars, the ones etched in marble, taught in schools, and filmed in Hollywood. World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Iraq. But what about the wars that vanished between the pages? The quiet conflicts that shaped nations, shifted borders, and still echo through the headlines of today, even if we no longer see their names. These are the forgotten wars of America's past, and whether we know it or not, they continue to define the world we live in. Let's start with a war most Americans have never heard of, the Philippine-American War. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States, fresh from victory in the Spanish-American War, turned its gaze toward the Pacific and the Philippines. What followed was brutal. Hundreds of thousands of civilians killed, villages burned, and a nation forced under a new colonial rule. It was America's first overseas war and its first major act of empire. Today, the scars still remain. Military bases, political alliances, and economic dependencies that trace directly back to that forgotten occupation. Modern foreign policy in Southeast Asia still carries the shadow of that beginning. Then came Latin America, the invisible battlefield of the 20th century. Cuba, Nicaragua, Chile, Panama. While the world focused on the Cold War between superpowers, America fought a quieter war in the shadows, coups, interventions, and economic domination. The goal wasn't territory, it was influence. And the cost was democracy itself. Many of the migration crises, the political unrest, and the economic instability we see today in Central and South America are the echoes of those secret wars. Wars waged not with armies, but with money, propaganda, and power. And then there are the conflicts fought not on foreign soil, but within. The war on drugs, the war on terror, the endless wars declared against invisible enemies that reshaped civil liberties, expanded surveillance, and redefined what freedom means in the 21st century. Forgotten conflicts don't die, they transform. They slip into policy, into prejudice, into systems that outlive their original battles. They become part of the air we breathe. Take, for example, the Korean War, often called the Forgotten War. It ended without peace, and yet 70 years later, it still divides families, still fuels military tension, still shapes American defense spending and foreign relations. Every missile launched, every negotiation stalled. They're all ghosts of a war that never truly ended. These forgotten wars remind us of something uncomfortable, that history doesn't just repeat itself because we forget. It repeats because we choose not to remember. When a conflict is hidden from memory, its lessons are never learned, and the same mistakes are born again under new names. The invisible wars of yesterday explain the broken alliances of today. They shape trade deals, fuel distrust, and decide who is seen as friend or foe. The world map might look different, but the patterns are the same. And maybe that's the real tragedy. We spend billions building monuments to the wars we want to remember, but none for the wars we need to remember. Because in the silence of forgotten conflicts lies the blueprint of the present. The reason oil prices rise, the reason alliances fracture, the reason refugees flee homes built on broken promises. History is not just what happened, it's what continues to happen when no one's paying attention. So the next time someone says, "That war was long ago," remember this: wars don't end when the guns go silent. They end when the truth is finally told. And until we tell it, honestly, completely, without filters or flags, the ghosts of those forgotten wars will keep marching beside us, shaping our world from the shadows. History doesn't disappear, it fades. Not because the facts are gone, but because we stop looking for them. This is the power of historical amnesia, a quiet force that shapes nations more effectively than war ever could. It doesn't destroy the past, it edits it. Every country does it. Every empire perfects it. And in America, it's become an art form. We remember the triumphs, the flags raised, the speeches made, the victories that fit neatly into a story of greatness. But we forget the blood beneath the foundation, the contradictions, the betrayals, the silenced truths that make that greatness possible. Ask yourself this: how many Americans know that Tulsa, Oklahoma, was once home to one of the wealthiest black communities in the nation, before it was burned to the ground in 1921 by a mob, and then erased from history books for nearly a century? How many know about the sterilization of indigenous women that continued into the 1970s? Or the secret radiation experiments performed on citizens without their knowledge during the Cold War? These aren't accidents of memory, they're choices. The uncomfortable truth is this: forgetting is not passive, it's an act of power. When a government decides what gets written, what gets taught, and what gets quietly buried, it decides who gets remembered as a hero and who disappears as a footnote. That's how myths are made. The myth of the American dream, the myth of progress without consequence, the myth that freedom has always been free, but historical amnesia has a cost, and we're paying it now. It's why some people see social justice movements as threats instead of reckonings. It's why we still debate whether racism still exists when its architecture is built into our cities, our banks, our schools. When we forget, we repeat. We rebuild the same systems under new names. We elect leaders who promise a return to greatness without ever asking what that greatness cost or who paid the price. History is not neutral. It's a mirror. And when we refuse to look into it, we lose sight of who we really are. The truth is, memory is resistance. To remember is to reclaim power. That's why archives are destroyed during wars, why books are banned, why protests are silenced. Because remembering, honestly, painfully, forces us to confront what we'd rather hide. But something is shifting. Across America, new generations are digging through the dust, unearthing stories long buried under patriotism and propaganda. They're using documentaries, podcasts, classrooms, and even TikTok to resurrect the voices of those erased. They're proving that history doesn't belong to the victors. It belongs to the truth tellers, because when we see the full picture, the glory and the guilt, we start to understand the present not as chaos, but as consequence. Every protest, every inequality, every political storm, they're not random. They're echoes. And the more we forget, the louder those echoes become. Amnesia may protect comfort, but memory protects justice. And if America ever hopes to heal, it must first learn to remember not just the stories that make us proud, but the ones that make us human. Because a nation that cannot face its past will forever be haunted by it. Every hidden story carries a spark, a quiet ember buried beneath time, waiting for someone brave enough to breathe life back into it. History, when revealed, doesn't just explain who we were, it challenges who we are. That's the power of hidden histories. They don't just rewrite the past, they reshape the future. Think about it. When the stories of enslaved inventors came to light, men and women who created technologies their masters took credit for, it forced us to confront how genius can flourish even in chains. When the voices of native leaders, poets, and warriors were finally heard, they reframed the story of America, not as a tale of discovery, but of survival. And when the buried truth of women's labor movements and queer activism began to surface, it didn't just fill gaps in textbooks, it redrew the map of who built this nation and who still fights to keep it whole. Every hidden story revealed is an act of rebellion, a challenge to the machinery of silence, because history isn't dead. It breathes through us. It shapes the way we vote, the way we teach, the way we see our neighbors. When we uncover forgotten truths, we reclaim something bigger than memory. We reclaim agency. We begin to understand that the systems we live under weren't born inevitable. They were designed. And what is designed can be redesigned. Look around you. From classrooms reintroducing Indigenous history, to filmmakers documenting untold civil rights battles, to communities demanding the return of stolen artifacts, we are witnessing a quiet revolution of remembrance. It's happening in museums, in podcasts, in TikTok documentaries, made by teenagers who refuse to let the truth die. It's happening in classrooms, where teachers dare to go beyond the sanitized syllabus, where students question why certain names are missing, and what that omission says about power. This is how change begins, not with laws, but with awareness. Because awareness is contagious. Once you see the full picture, you can't unsee it. You start connecting dots between slavery and mass incarceration, between colonization and modern poverty, between environmental racism and corporate greed, and suddenly, history stops being the past. It becomes the blueprint of our present. That's why those who fear change fear history, because truth dismantles myths. And myths are what keep the powerful comfortable, but the cracks are showing. Across the world, people are reclaiming their histories, not just as facts, but as weapons of understanding. Because knowing where the wounds came from is the first step toward healing them. Every uncovered story becomes a mirror, showing us not what America pretends to be, but what it truly is, a nation still being written by every voice once silenced. And here's the most radical truth of all: remembering doesn't divide us. It unites us through honesty, because only when we face the entire story the beauty and the brutality, the progress and the pain, can we begin to write the next chapter with clarity. Hidden histories aren't threats to patriotism. They're proof that patriotism can evolve. That love for a country isn't about denying its sins, but about demanding it live up to its ideals. So when we tell these stories, in classrooms, in films, in families, we're not just rewriting history. We're reclaiming the soul of a nation, because truth once spoken doesn't fade again. It echoes, it challenges, it heals, and maybe that's what America has always needed most. Not another myth to believe in, but the courage to finally face the truth. The stories we've uncovered don't belong in the dark anymore. They live beyond the pages of forgotten books, beyond the walls of silent museums. They live where people choose to remember, in communities, archives, and voices refusing to fade. If you want to find America's hidden histories, don't just look in the history section of a library. Look in the margins. That's where truth has always survived. In a small community center in Tulsa, descendants of the 1921 massacre keep photos, letters, and oral stories alive, not as relics, but as proof. Proof that erasure failed. In New Mexico, indigenous storytellers record ancestral songs to preserve languages once banned by law, turning memory into resistance. In Detroit, a group of retired factory workers transformed an abandoned warehouse into a living museum of the labor movement. Each photo on the wall tells a story of grit, unity, and the cost of progress that history books prefer to skip. And across the country, in classrooms, teachers are bringing these lost voices back, not as footnotes, but as the foundation of what America truly is. It's no longer about waiting for permission to tell these stories. It's about reclaiming them. Digital archives, podcasts, TikTok series, grassroots documentaries, the new historians aren't just scholars. They're ordinary people with microphones, cameras, and the courage to remember. On a street in Charleston, an artist paints the faces of forgotten freedom fighters on the walls of old buildings. He says, if the textbooks won't remember them, the city will, and that's the power of visibility. Because history, once seen, can't be unseen again. You'll find truth in places the system never meant for it to survive, in church basements, in protest songs, in family Bibles that still hold the names of enslaved ancestors written in faded ink. Every generation finds its own way to preserve the stories that matter. Some write them, some sing them, some film them, but all of them carry the same mission: to make sure silence never wins. These archives of resistance exist everywhere. The National Museum of African American History in Washington, the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque, the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, the Tenement Museum in New York, each one a heartbeat in the living memory of a country still trying to tell its whole story. And beyond the institutions, there's something even more powerful: the oral tradition. Grandparents who whisper memories to their grandchildren before sleep, neighbors who gather at community halls to retell local histories erased from official records. These are the archives of the soul. They can't be digitized, but they can be passed on from heart to heart, from generation to generation, because the truth doesn't just live in documents, it lives in people. Every time you share one of these stories, you extend its life. Every time you question a version of history that feels too clean, you become part of the uncovering. This movement of remembrance is no longer a whisper, it's a chorus, a collective refusal to forget. And the beauty of it all, you don't need permission to join it. You can visit these museums, watch their documentaries, listen to the voices of descendants online. You can amplify what they've protected, because remembering is an act of participation, and that's where hidden histories live now, not behind glass, but in our hands, our feeds, our voices. The tools of remembrance are everywhere, and the responsibility to use them belongs to all of us. So, when you close this video, don't let the story end here. Go find the others, listen, read, share, because every time a forgotten name is spoken again, Every time a buried truth finds light, America becomes a little more honest and maybe a little more whole. Memory is not passive. It's not something that simply happens. It's something we choose. And that choice carries weight. Because when we decide what to remember, we also decide what to forget. America has always struggled with that choice. We've built monuments to victory, but buried the bones of injustice. We celebrate freedom, but often forget who paid the price for it. Remembrance isn't just about nostalgia. It's about accountability. It's about looking at the full picture, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it challenges everything we were taught to believe. The responsibility of remembrance begins with honesty. Honesty about the land we stand on, the labor that built our cities, and the systems that decided whose stories were worthy of being told. For centuries, the narrative of America has been curated, edited for comfort, simplified for patriotism, sanitized for textbooks. But the truth was never simple. It was bloody, it was complicated, and it was shared by millions who never made it into the story. To remember them is not to hate the nation, it's to honor its full humanity. Because love of country doesn't mean blind devotion. It means seeing its flaws clearly and still believing it can do better. The responsibility of remembrance is collective. It doesn't belong to historians alone. It belongs to teachers, parents, filmmakers, to every person who tells a story, every person who listens. It's in the hands of the artist who paints forgotten heroes on a city wall, the journalist who risks their job to tell the truth, the student who asks a question no one wants to answer. To remember is to resist silence, to refuse the comfort of ignorance, to say, no, this happened and it matters. Every generation inherits not just a history, but a responsibility to confront what came before, to repair what can be repaired, and to carry the stories forward with dignity. Some will say, let the past stay buried, but buried things don't disappear. They wait, they whisper. And when we ignore them, they haunt us in ways we don't understand, in policies, in prejudice, in pain that never seems to end. Remembrance, then, is a form of healing. It allows us to bring what's hidden into the light, to see the wound, to finally begin the work of making it whole. When we say the names of those forgotten, when we acknowledge the histories that were erased, we restore something sacred, their existence, their humanity, their right to be remembered. But remembrance isn't just an act of looking back. It's a guide for how we move forward. It teaches us empathy. It teaches us humility. It reminds us that progress without reflection is just repetition. Every story we recover, every truth we face, every silence we break adds one more thread to the fabric of who we are, because nations, like people, are shaped by memory. Erase too much and you lose yourself. Remember fully and you evolve. So let us remember not just the triumphs but the tragedies, not just the heroes but the victims, not just the dreams but the debts. Let us remember because remembrance is the foundation of justice, because silence serves only the powerful, and because history doesn't end, it echoes. We carry those echoes in us, and what we choose to do with them, that's where the real story of America begins. So now the question is not what happened, but what will we do with what we know? Because history, when uncovered, demands more than curiosity. It demands courage. Courage to question. Courage to care. Courage to act. The stories we've unearthed, the buried truths, the silenced voices, the invisible hands that shape this nation, they're not just echoes from the past. They're instructions for the future. Every forgotten name, every erased struggle, every quiet act of resistance calls out to us now, not to feel guilty, but to feel responsible. America's hidden history isn't just a revelation, it's a mirror. And when we dare to look into it, we see both the cracks and the light. We see who we've been and who we still have the power to become. So here's the truth. Each of us holds a thread in the story of this country. Every choice we make, what we read, what we share, what we teach our children, weaves a new chapter. one that can be more honest, more inclusive, more worthy of the ideals we claim to stand for. This isn't about rewriting the past, it's about finishing it, completing the story that was never allowed to be told. When we acknowledge the truths that history tried to bury, we give voice to the voiceless. We breathe life into the forgotten. We turn silence into strength. That is the real power of remembrance. It's not about guilt or blame, it's about awakening. So ask yourself, what stories will you carry forward? Whose names will you speak? What truths will you refuse to let die in the dark? Because the more we bring into the light, the stronger the light becomes. And in that light, we find something sacred, connection, understanding, hope. The time for silence has passed. The time for awareness has come. Every conversation you start, every book you open, every story you share, it matters. It pushes back against the tide of forgetting. If these hidden histories have moved you, if they've made you question, if they've made you feel, then don't stop here. Keep exploring. Keep learning. Keep listening. Because America's real story isn't written in stone. It's written in us. And if we choose to see it, to speak it, to share it, we can change not just how history is remembered, but how the future is made. At Best Hidden America, we believe truth deserves to be seen, heard, and remembered. So if you believe that too, join us. Be part of this journey. Subscribe, share, and help us uncover the stories that shaped this nation, the ones that still whisper beneath the surface, waiting for someone to listen. Because history doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to the brave, to those willing to look deeper, ask harder questions, and see America, not as a myth, but as a living, breathing story still being written. And maybe, just maybe, the next chapter begins with you.